Hello, everyone. Once again, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to have Mukund here, Mukund Padmanabhan, and so pleased to be discussing his book with him, The Great Flap of 1942. Mukund is an old friend, and I happened to be with him in South India when the early notices and early praise for the book began to come in. And all us friends had a great time ribbing him about the high words of praise that he received. But each and every word was deserved. This is a book I wish I'd written. I don't think I'm capable of it. It's an extraordinary book. It starts quite quietly and stays at a certain pace. But once you get engrossed in the book, once you immerse yourself in this whole story, you really can't put it down. It's a story that we should know better, but we don't, which is that when the Japanese invade Malaya and when they start heading down towards Singapore and up towards Rangoon, it sets off a huge tsunami of panic across India, and especially the coastal cities. And the story of that panic is what Mukul digs into with such verve and precision and humor that, I can only recommend that you grab the book and read it. Mukund, obvious question, how did you start to think about writing this book?
As I say in the book, I grew up with the story. My mother was one of those who fled Madras, lived for a whole year in Coimbatore, and then returned to continue her education, which got disrupted, and then she couldn't get back into Madras. She had to move somewhere else. Her house was completely ransacked when they came back. So yeah, we've all grown up with this story. My father's family fled through. In fact, I haven't met yet a single friend in Madras whose family has not fled Madras. So I knew somewhere that there was a story waiting to be written, but I was engaged sort of at work as a journalist, and I couldn't make the time to do this. So it was only after I gave journalism up that I was able to do the necessary research for this story. So essentially, initially, I thought the panic was limited more or less largely to Madras. I knew Calcutta was affected, and there's lots of Calcutta in the book. But as I continued, mining the archives and the newspapers, I found that this was pan-Indian. And as you say, it happened from the coast, but it also happened inland. I mean, the British talk of an exodus from Delhi, from Ahmedabad. People took flight in Jamshedpur. Even unlikely places such as Kodaikanal were not touched by the panic.
That surprised me a lot.
Yes, because I think American missionaries went into a panic because of some rumor and fled. The British attributed the panic sometimes to Indian timidity, and that was all right as long as it happened. But there was a lot of there was a lot of despair. The fact that it affected Europeans as well, basically white people who lived there. And Governor Hope, who was the governor of the Madras presidency, actually, is sort of very upset that Europeans were caught in the Great Flap of 1942.
But he covers himself in glory with all these indecisions and wrong decisions and his fights with Lilithgow and the whole business of we must get rid of useless mouths or superfluous mouths. Yeah. And when you put that in the context of the Bengal famine, or you put it in the context of how the British treated the white road and the black road out of Burma, you begin to yet again see an example of the huge racism that underpinned empire and the cowardice in the face of the first real threat that they face, don't you?
Yes. I didn't know, and I don't think I have read an account anywhere that the panic was actually, or the exodus, was actually tacitly encouraged by the British, which it was. And Lilithgow uses the word useless mouths. He wants useless mouths to go. He wants people engaged in essential services and people engaged in war production to remain. Because if the Japanese attacked, the British believed that cities that had a reduced population would be easier to manage. So the governors in places like Bengal and in Bombay are trying to do what they see as a management job, basically trying to get people they want to remain, and people, they don't want to go, but always fearing that if they allow too many people to go, then essential people would go as well. So they saw it as a management problem, essentially.
Yeah, that's a tricky bit, because the useful mouths need to stay and carry on working till such time as the city falls, or, you know, and then the administration is again left towards the end of the book. I'm giving the game away a bit, but one of the last things is one of the British officers turns around to the Tamilian administrator and says, I don't have time to discuss details with you. Do what you like. I have to catch the train. And he jumps on the train and buzzes off.
Yeah. So in three places, the government actually moves. One, the big move, of course, is Madras, and Hope's government just scatters all over the presidency. Virtually every department moves to another city, to Salem, to Bangalore, to Anantapur. The High Court moves as well. So what remains in Madras is just the skeleton staff. You know, couple of his advisors, the corporation commissioner, and maybe a couple of other officials. The entire government just disbands. But what is less, what is less known, and I keep asking this question of Malayalis and Oriyas, is the Cuttack. You know, the capital was just shifted to Sambalpur in April of 1942. And it's just surprising that stories like this have just, you know, almost vanished from historical memory. And I asked the same question when I was at the Kerala Lit Fest, both in Calicut and in Trivandrum, whether they knew that the secretariat in Cochin had moved to Thrissur inland. And nobody did. So I think, and may I just add, I think it's a reflection of, I think, a couple of things at least. One is that our interest in history has been very, very focused on the nationalist movement. You know, 42 has been remembered for the Cripps mission, and then finally, of course, you know, Gandhi's you know, call for quit India, and those, we've spent reams and reams of newsprint on those very important events. I'm not running them down. But not so much on this, despite the fact that at least conservatively 75% of Madras fled, 17% of Calcutta left in 17 days, and then much more afterwards. 25% of Bombay left. I mean, this was a big story in terms of the exodus, but somehow, and I think this is a failing of the press itself, not just the British press, but the nationalist press.
And the historians.
And the historians. Well, I mean, you know.
Except for Indivar, who does.
Yeah, Indivar, my good friend, does, has, I think, written the formative essay on this called The Shiver of 1942. But it gets lost. It gets lost because I think partly the Japanese invasion never happened, and partly because our interest in the issue, both I think as historians and both as journalists as well, I had to really go through newspapers to find little scraps of single column items which said, you know, the government estimates 30% of the population has fled by this time, and a little more after that, and you know, relief camps set up. So the story was not even talked about then in a sort of substantial way.
Because it was an embarrassment for the British, and it was an irrelevance for the nationalist struggle. So, I mean, Calcutta, of course, Buddhadev Bose talks about the fact that he was a bureaucrat, and he was told to move some of his files would be going to Patna, others would be going to Ranchi, and there were all these plans in place. But somehow Calcutta, which is supposed to be at the front line, doesn't empty out so much as Cuttack does, or Madras does, right? Or Visakhapatnam.
Yeah.
My father, Gujarati, working in Bada Bazaar, remembered the story passed on to me was that all the communities here, the Marwadis, the Gujaratis, the Sindhis, they all left. But he stayed on because he wanted to see what happened. He was a young man full of curiosity. He says, well, let the Japanese come. I want to see what they do. I'm not going anywhere. And, but Calcutta was a strange place, 17%, right? In two exodus. First, 1941, then again in 1942, and the actual bombs start falling. And then the biggest bombing happens in 43 when some of these people are yet again back a second time. So it's quite weird. Question I had, fascinating in your book, is the Cripps mission is there. There's Nehru's reaction to the war, there's Gandhi's reaction to the war, there's Patel's reaction, and Rajagopalachari. Can you tell us a bit more about how the different nationalists
I try to make a case that the war, and particularly the entry of Japan, actually divided the Congress in significant ways. We know, for instance, Gandhi was against the Cripps mission right from the very beginning. Gandhiji didn't want to meet Cripps. He left it to Nehru and Azad. And it was only after Cripps reached out to him, he says something, I don't remember the exact words, but he says, oh, if you want to see me, then I will see you, and meets him. And the reason why Gandhiji doesn't want to see him is he knows that any Congress support for the British war effort would go against his creed of nonviolence. So he had a sort of position on nonviolence which, pitted him against the mission itself. There are British historians who argue that, that Gandhiji virtually scuppered the Cripps mission. This is not what many Indian historians say. They treat the Cripps mission as if it were a negotiation between two people and the offer was not good enough, which of course it wasn't. But I suggest that you need to look at Cripps at least against the background of the shadow of the Japanese threat. Because when Cripps was in India, he arrived in the end of March 1942, he was here for a few days, the Andaman Islands are taken. Visakhapatnam is bombed, within a fortnight of it.
Rangoon has just fallen.
Kakinada is bombed. Then Ceylon and Trincomalee are bombed. The Hermes is sunk. Destroyers are sunk. So the Japanese are in the Indian Ocean taking down merchant ships in the Bay of Bengal. Sorry, not in the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal. And so to imagine that none of this influenced our nationalists, I think is probably, I think there was some impact, and I suggest that it's important to look at it against the threat.
The microphone, you need to.
Yeah.
Hello. I think, are you getting Mukund's voice? Because I'm...
No.
Yeah, I think you have to
okay.
point it to the point top of
Sorry.
it. Yeah. So, no, really interesting. So it's your theory is that Gandhi expected Japan to win, right? Or you imply that?
Well, I mean, the idea that Gandhi expected Japan to win can't be discounted. For one, it's not just Gandhi. There were lots of other Indians who expected Japan to win. Remember, from Malaya, the British lost everything, and they lost everything very quickly. So we're talking about December 7th, 1941, when they launched this attack on Malaya, synchronous with Pearl Harbor. They go down Malaya, they take Singapore. Meanwhile, Hong Kong has fallen without not much resistance. The Dutch Indies is gone. All this happens within a space of a few months. There is, Azad, for instance, says that Gandhi expected Japan to win. There is a sort of British an account of a meeting that the Congress held where Nehru says the same thing. Gandhiji thinks Japan will win. And Gandhi actually was then accused or charged, which I think very unfairly, that he was pro-Japanese, which he wasn't. And he actually writes more than one piece saying why I'm not pro-Japanese. I mean, essentially, it was his position of nonviolence that I think influenced him in one way. And I think, unlike others, I mean, there was a certain moral equivalence he saw between aggression and counter-aggression. He was, for him, I mean, he did say more than once during the war that, just because somebody attacks you, you don't, rain fire back at them simply because, nothing is going to come of this. So there was a sort of deep-seated pacifism, which some people saw as absolute and wonderful. Others within the party saw as unrealistic and naive. And this played out in the Congress.
Because you've got Rajaji saying that people must arm themselves and fight when the Japanese come. And Nehru, of course, as we know, is strongly anti-fascist in every way. I cannot imagine Sardar Patel thinking that people should lay down their lives or their arms when the Japanese come. He would have been ambivalent about that as well. Um, what comes out find fascinating in the book is how the pressure of this invasion that never comes and the fear of it sort of thuds like billiard balls and makes other balls go into pockets. For example, we know the famine, the huge contribution of this fear to the Great Bengal famine, right? We know that the boats were taken away and the cycles were taken away and the rice rice may have been bought anyway. But the other two things were because the Japanese were so effective in Malaya with the boats and bikes. Down in Vishakhapatnam, all kinds of other measures are taken. Madras Zoo, one in the most fascinating story, which I also have in the book I'm currently, because in the verses that same article that we read, people go and slaughter animals in the zoo. And then when you read Chris Bailey and the book about the Forgotten Wars, you realize that in Jakarta, the tigers and stuff did get out during bombing and started roaming the streets. So, and in other places as well.
Yeah,
right?
in Europe.
In Europe. So it wasn't an unreal fear. So all these strange, surreal things happen under the radar. What does this whole flap tell us about the different, which is what I found fascinating about the book, the pressure tells us something about the British administration. It tells us something about the press in India. It tells us the third thing about the leaders and the general public, and differently in Madras and Calcutta and Vizag and Orissa. So can you talk a bit about what it reveals to you?
You mean the British leaders or the?
I mean the whole flap, what kind of, that pressure, what did it reveal to you about the different players in your book?
Well, I mean, I've made the point about the press. I think when we think,
the press at that time, the English.
Yeah, so when we think of the press at that time, sometimes we talk of a golden age. But we forget that newspapers at that time were essentially mainly newspapers of record. They did press statements, they did press conferences, they reported news as it broke, official news. They did very, very little.
Editorializing.
They editorialized. I mean, there are editorials in all the papers about the panic and why you shouldn't panic and all of that. But there's no reporting. I mean, imagine if it's possible, and I think it's possible, that almost 90% of Madras fled. I would have imagined there would be reams and reams written about an empty city, photographs taken of an empty city. I tried to look for all of that, and I couldn't find it, neither in the sort of British-owned mail or in the Indian newspapers. So I don't think we did that kind of reporting. And I'm not surprised, because one of the things, I mean, you talk to Burma, you know, some 100,000, 500,000 possibly, people did the long march out of Burma into India. They took months, they were ravaged by cholera, malaria, all of that. How many records survive? I mean,
very few.
Very, very few. I mean, Indians are pretty hopeless at keeping, you know, records of events like this. And I think one of the reasons why the flap, just like the Long March, hasn't got recorded is because of us. I think we need to blame ourselves for not, you know, you don't expect the British to keep a record about Exodus.
It's a moment of great shame for them.
Yeah.
So the archivist in them would have hesitated, I suspect. Tell us the story a bit more of your research. So you start digging, you start where, and you went all the way to London, British Library, everything. So tell us a bit
initially, more about. I was thinking of writing something much slimmer than this, just about Madras. And as I started researching it, I think two things happened. One is that I found that the story demanded a larger narrative arc. I had to go from Malaya. I had to actually track the quick Japanese successes in Southeast Asia, and analyze their impact on India, because the exodus, you know, began in 1941 in Calcutta first, I think, but the fall of Singapore triggered off another exodus. The people coming from Burma triggered off. There were many, many causes why people left, apart from the fact that the British encouraged it. There were rumors that actually also triggered the exodus. So that was that was one aspect, looking outside India. The other was, and I didn't know this when I'd started, I didn't know that the exodus was, happened pretty much everywhere in some number. And we know that there were large numbers of people fled northeast. I mean, we know that, Guwahati, Impal, places like that were touched too by, and there are records of this from British communication.
So what was your approach? You started digging in newspaper
I
files
started
here.
digging. COVID came in the way. I had to make a trip to England, which became possible only in July 2022. So that was the large, major chunk of research.
At the British Library?
Yeah, and at the British Library. And I think after that, I'd written bits out before, but it was 1 year after that that I got it done.
They say you have to kill your darlings. So what is the most painful, the best story that you've had to leave out of the book?
I tried very hard not to write a long book. I was conscious. I just thought a longer book, it would be more difficult to engage the reader, and I thought something in the region of this size would be the best format. So I did leave out a lot. I mean, I could have included many more rumors. I could have described the battles in some more detail. I could have gone into the formation of the INA in greater detail. Maybe talked about the resolutions and the issues that the Congress was caught in greater detail. But I just felt perhaps it was enough to tick the main points. So I don't regret leaving anything out necessarily. But I wanted to write it as a piece of narrative nonfiction. So whenever there was a story that interested me, even if it didn't have a great bearing on the war, I made sure I included, and I'll just tell you one of them, which you would have come across. I mean, the brother of the poet W.H. Auden, actually, along with Bhatnagar, who then becomes one of the important members in the Indian scientific establishment, prepares a sort of cheap tarry substance, and a British ICS official allows him to put this tarry substance in braziers all around army headquarters, which is in South Block in Delhi. And they do this experiment of sort of lighting it up. And the idea was that it would produce such dense clouds of smoke that Japanese aircraft wouldn't see them. And the funny thing about this is this happened in Delhi, which was not even under threat. I mean, a Japanese aircraft couldn't come.
For Japanese aircraft to have bombed Delhi, they would have had to be in Patna or Bhopal.
At that time, they'd have to refuel. They couldn't do it, and there's no refuel facility. And then allowed this to happen. Of course, the experiment failed. This tarry substance didn't produce the smoke that they wanted. So there are lots of little stories like this which I found very interesting. Even Governor Hope, who is finally pulled out because they notice he's borrowed large sums of money to bet in the Madras racecourse. So he's pulled out, and it's only 70 years later that we know he was recalled, because the Times in London has this report, that says he was pulled out. Everyone was in the know, from the king to the prime minister, why he was pulled out. But this has remained a secret, until some 70 years later. And Hope himself is a complex character, because he's constantly writing to Lithgow saying, don't lie, don't be economical with the truth. You're causing more panic by keeping the true damage that is done to Rangoon and Vishakhapatnam and other places. It's these kinds of stories that kind of interest me.
Okay, I think question and answers. Please, let's have some questions. Start with you.
Hi, this is a very thought-provoking book. I haven't read it yet, but it raises many questions in my mind, because I am also a historian. So, of course, it was a time of quit India. There seems to be a sort of dichotomy in this, people fleeing, and then also the success of the INA and people waiting for deliverance from British colonialism, by this pan-Asian idea of Japan, that Japan had fed to Asia. So why was there this disconnect? Why were people fleeing? They were not ready to welcome the Japanese. Is a question. So somewhere obviously there was enough propaganda to make them fear it. And then I just sort of want to raise, were they aware of the Nanjing massacre in China? Because it was also something that, as I understood, wasn't so well reported, at least in China. And I just want to give a little aside while I have the mic, and then I'll give it up. In Singapore, apparently, when the Japanese occupied Singapore and they led away British colonial serving officers and so on, took POWs actually, short form, took POWs away in chains. It changed the psyche of the people. They thought these white men were unassailable, and here they were being led off in chains, led them to understand they never needed to be subjugated to them again, which then subsequently hastened their nationalist freedom, national freedom.
Yeah. Shall I answer?
Please.
Yeah, I completely agree with the last part that of, which is really a comment and not a question. I think the Japanese punctured the idea that Asians were not good at fighting, or the Europeans would remain, and they punctured it really fast, because there was not a thing that the British won, in 42. The tide changed much later, after the Americans' Navy was sort of activated into taking up the Japanese, and the Japanese strength really lay in the Navy, and they lost it after the Battle of Coral Sea and Midway. So absolutely right. There was a large body in India, I think, and I think the INA, the formation of the INA was an eye-opener, I think, both for Indians and for the British, because most of the people who the Japanese captured just went over to the INA. And they thought it was the right nationalist thing to do was to go over. And that happened in Malaya and then in Singapore. And, there was a famous meeting in the Farrer Park where I think the people are divided into those that move over and become a part of the pro-Japanese INA, and those who want to remain loyal to the British. But most people go towards the INA. And then, of course, the Japanese discriminate between the two. They treat the ones who are on their side quite well. They treat the others very well. But the Japanese generally treated Indians very well, because I think they saw them as possible, people that they could use. There's one story in the book about Prem Sehgal, who's actually captured by the Japanese, and he's with a British officer, I think, who was either his equal or maybe subordinate, I'm not sure. And they both made to lean, and this Japanese guy takes his sword off, and so he's just prepared to die. And then the next thing he knows, he chops the head of the British soldier off, or the officer off, and then is invited to have, I don't know, eggs and a drink with the Japanese colonel afterwards. So they were hard on the British. I think the Chinese, they were hard on as well. But the Indians, they saw as a resource that could be used against the British. Yeah.
Also to add, I think, people in India did not have a clear idea, but they understood that the Japanese needed to bomb the cities to take them over. So they expected bombs to fall on Calcutta or Madras, and they were terrified. Even if they might have welcomed the Japanese, it was like, पहले तो निकल जाते हैं, फिर बाद में देखेंगे, that kind of thing.
Also, there was Rangoon, and what happened in Rangoon was terrible. So what happened in Rangoon, according to accounts, is that people came out on the streets to sort of watch the Japanese planes, as if it was some sort of, I don't know, air show or fair or something. And a lot of people died as a result of that. A little bit of that happened in Calcutta as well, I gather, at least that's what people say. So they weren't expecting this to happen.
Sam?
Sam.
Sam. Oh, sorry. We can take both. You go ahead first.
So what's exactly the time frame of the book? Where does it end? And especially keeping in mind the exodus in Calcutta, which were happening simultaneously, but that happened in two phases, 41 and 42.
There is the main time frame, the time frame of the flap, which sort of starts in December, when the Japanese attack Malaya, and goes on to about mid-42, when the this Japanese fleet that actually comes to the Indian Ocean, bombs Colombo, bombs Trincomalee, is doing a lot of damage to merchant shipping on the Bay of Bengal, actually go back. They call back to fight the Japanese. So that is the main period of the flap. But the book goes before that as well. To make the point that the fall of Singapore was sort of something that really shook both the British and India, because Singapore was cracked up as a sort of impregnable bastion by the British. There's this Cambridge historian who has a line saying every British schoolboy has been taught that. And Singapore just, crumbled. Once they had come south of Malaya, it just took them some weeks to take over Singapore.
And the big guns were pointing the wrong way.
Yeah, which Churchill said should be defended to the death. And they were forced to surrender. So I think that is the main period, but it does talk of the bombing, because a lot of bombing happened after that. As Ruchir says, there was the major bombing in 43. And also the other story is, when I thought of what the Japanese bombed, they had no plans to invade India. So, this is why I think the Raj panicked. They had never had any plans to invade India, not even Ceylon, which they bombed. All they wanted to do in Ceylon was to take out the Eastern Fleet, which the British had moved from Singapore to Trincomalee. And then, of course, another base in the Maldives, which they didn't know about. So they had no plans at all. But all they wanted to do was create a lot of disruption. And that's what actually set and triggered off this panic.
Okay.
Sam?
Yeah, you just answered my question, which was, what were the Japanese plans? But surely through the northeast and Kohima, they were planning to come by land.
So, yes. So there is, I end the narrative with the non-invasion. The invasion happens in 44. By that time, the Japs lose their naval supremacy. The Americans have fought 2 naval battles, one of them which sort of, is almost a Pyrrhic victory. The other one, the Japanese just lose. And it's naval power that really, most of the aircraft was sort of at sea. That's how the Japanese waged their wars. So by then, the British were far better armed. The British Army, the Indian Army then, sorry, were far better armed. And General Slim was able to push the Japanese back. There were fierce battles in Kohima in 44. But I don't get into that part. My story is a story about a panic, about an invasion that never happened. So when it actually happened 2 years later, it was something else.
And never was going to happen.
It never was going to happen. Yeah.
Well, I think we can safely say that the Japanese had no plans to invade coastal India.
If
the empire had crumbled, they would have sent soldiers through Imphal into Assam and
they had no plans in 42, which is when they were
plans in 42.
They had no plans in 42 at all, and their foray in 44. I think there was a lot of bloody battling in Kohima.
Last throw of the dice kind of
but
thing.
It was, exactly. By then, the Indian army was just much too strong, and they were pushed back, and it was just a complete reversal.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have to wrap up now.
Yeah,
Thank you,
I just want to tell everyone, I know Ruchir has been asking me all the questions, but he's almost finished, or is soon to finish, a novel based on the same period, which from all accounts is going to be fascinating. So I hope someday I will be
Yes, you
on
can
that side
come and
asking
question
you
my
questions
research. Yes,
on your
absolutely.
fiction,
Yeah.
and you know, please look forward to this when
Yeah.
it comes out. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, now we have to hold up the book.